In 1988, in the attic of an ordinary English home, a discovery was made that looked less like a forgotten family keepsake and more like evidence of a major state crime. According to Greta Winton's memoirs, she accidentally found a worn leather briefcase that her husband, a quiet British retiree, had hidden from his own family for exactly 50 years. Inside was a yellowed scrapbook packed with photographs of unknown children, copies of transit papers, and long columns of foreign names. In the surviving pages of that historic register, one final number stood out clearly: 669 names. 669 lives pulled from the very center of Europe's coming tragedy. A disturbing question follows. Why would a man who had carried out such an extraordinary act hide the proof in darkness, as if it were something shameful? And more importantly, how did an ordinary stockbroker, Nicholas Winton, with no diplomatic immunity and no spy network behind him, manage to outwit one of the most ruthless systems of the 20th century? He stayed silent for decades because the weight of those he had not managed to save before the purchase began stayed with him every day. But to understand the true meaning of that old briefcase and the mechanics of this astonishing rescue, we need to turn the clock back. Back to the day when one short phone call destroyed a young Londoner's holiday plans and led him straight into the center of disaster. Young, ambitious, and already very successful, Nicholas Winton was building a brilliant career as a stockbroker in the financial heart of London. His days were filled with market reports, private club meetings, tailored suits, and polished dinner conversation. Europe was already trembling with the sense of an approaching catastrophe, but the comfortable world of the London city, those fears still felt far away, like dry newspaper headlines that were not supposed to disturb the routine of respectable gentlemen. According to Winton's letters from that period, in December 1938 he was planning a perfectly ordinary and well-earned holiday, a luxury trip to a Swiss ski resort. And that raises the central psychological question. What inner force made a man at the height of comfort and stability step willingly into the heart of a geopolitical disaster? By then, the political climate in Europe had already passed the point of no return. The historical record shows that on September 30th, 1938, the infamous Munich Agreement was signed. Many European politicians presented it as a guarantee of lasting peace, but in reality it became a sentence for an entire independent state. The Sudetenland was stripped from Czechoslovakia, and hundreds of thousands of civilians, fleeing persecution and the threat of violent purges, poured deeper into the country in desperate search of safety in the capital. But why did British society ignore those warning signs for so long, clinging to the fragile illusion of safety? How could so many fail to see that the machinery of war had already begun to move? Nicholas could easily have turned away from all of it. His expensive tickets were already bought, his heavy suitcases packed with warm ski clothes, and his room in the snowy Swiss Alps reserved. British newspapers described the situation in Central Europe as tense but still under diplomatic control, allowing ordinary people to sleep peacefully. Winton was packing the last of his things, imagining mountain air and quiet evenings by the fire. The illusion of normal life lasted until the final moment. His tickets to Switzerland were already on his desk when the telephone rang sharply in his London flat. On the line was his school friend Martin Blake, who spoke a short sentence that changed Nicholas's path forever. The conversation with Martin Blake was brief, direct, and urgent. Blake, who was working with the British Committee for Refugees, was already in Prague and had seen the growing humanitarian catastrophe with his own eyes. He urged Nicholas to cancel the ski holiday immediately and come to him at once, saying he had an important task that required fresh energy and a practical mind. And Nicholas, a man with no experience in field operations or international humanitarian work, gave up his holiday without hesitation. According to biographical records, at the very end of December 1938, Winton arrived at Prague's wind-beaten railway station. And that brings us to a very practical question. How exactly did he plan to operate in a foreign country where he had no diplomatic status, no fixed plan, and no government connections? The contrast between festive London, glowing with Christmas lights, and Prague, dark and overflowing with human despair, was enormous. Reports from international relief missions show that in a very short time, nearly 250,000 refugees from the occupied Sudetenland had gathered in the Czech capital. 250,000 exhausted, frightened people who had lost their homes, their property, and any means of support almost overnight. Those numbers are horrifying enough by themselves, but even more shocking was the cold response of the slow-moving bureaucracies around them. How could the international community allow such a concentration of human suffering in one European city and respond with little more than formal concern? Families slept on freezing streets, crowded into unheated barracks, and tried to survive the brutal winter cold. Nicholas immediately tried to involve himself in the work of the charitable groups, already struggling to function in the paralyzed city. Declassified aid committee records show that most diplomatic and financial efforts were focused almost entirely on saving adults. Prominent dissidents, intellectuals, artists, and writers who faced immediate danger from the advancing regime. Transit visas were somehow found for them, and secret escape routes were organized. But when Winton stepped into Prague's cold streets and looked closely at the faces in those freezing crowds, he realized something terrifying. International committees were working hard to save politicians and intellectuals, but there was one enormous, completely defenseless group of people whom everyone in that bureaucratic chaos had forgotten. Once he understood that the official committees were blind to the fate of the most vulnerable refugees, Nicholas Winton made an unprecedented decision. He would act on his own. He had no office, no trained team, and no clear idea how to move people legally across Europe's tightening borders. He had only one unshakable conviction. If he turned his back on those families freezing in the streets of Prague, thousands of young lives would be destroyed by the catastrophe that was closing in. So he used the only thing he had, his temporary lodging. Winton went down into the elegant restaurant of the Alcron Hotel, pushed a few chairs aside, and turned an ordinary dining table into an unofficial rescue headquarters. Later diaries from people who joined his effort record that by early January 1939, this improvised reception point was already working at full speed. And that raises another question. How did desperate people with no access to newspapers or radio learn so quickly about a British man willing to listen to their pleas? The oldest and simplest system of all went to work. Word of mouth, driven by total desperation. Rumors of a foreigner in a good suit who is writing down the names of those in danger spread through the refugee barracks like wildfire. In letters Winton sent to his mother during that period, he wrote that between 20 and 50 families a day crowded around his small table in the restaurant, begging him to take their greatest treasure. But why did European diplomacy leave this problem on the shoulders of one tourist? Every meeting became an emotional ordeal. Parents, barely holding back tears, tried to prove that their own child deserved a chance to survive, holding out crumpled birth certificates and small black and white photographs. Hotel records from that time mention hundreds of visitors who stood for hours in the lobby waiting for a chance to speak to Nicholas. They came in a constant stream from dawn until late at night. Drawing on the habits of a stockbroker, Winton carefully recorded every name, age, and distinguishing detail, knowing that a single mistake could cost someone a future. He worked himself to exhaustion, slept very little, and ate only in passing, trying to bring some order to an ocean of human misery. The line of parents stretched across staircases and filled every open corner of the fashionable building. But the British volunteer still did not know that every move he made was already being watched from the shadows. Prague in early 1939 was saturated with fear and suspicion. The city was full of spies, informers, and agents of the neighboring power preparing the ground for invasion. The Alcron Hotel, where Winton was staying, was a natural meeting place for foreign diplomats and journalists, which meant it was almost certainly under surveillance. Surviving records from the Czechoslovak secret police, dated January 1939, clearly show that all suspicious foreigners whose activities went beyond ordinary tourism were being monitored. And that leads to a chilling question. How long could a young broker run a rescue operation right under the noses of professional intelligence services before they came for him in the middle of the night? Every time Nicholas left the hotel to meet underground contacts or inspect refugee camps, he felt the heavy stare of men in identical gray coats. Reports secretly passed by local informants described Winton's work as a potential threat to public order, and his contact with dissidents raised serious suspicion. The danger to Nicholas himself, and to those brave enough to pass him documents, grew by the hour. Any list of names that fell into the wrong hands could become a death sentence for hundreds of families, turning into a ready-made database for future purges. Winton had to change routes constantly, use coded language in his correspondence, and trust his instincts. The pressure kept building. Hotel administration records from that tense month suggest that Winton's room, which had become a de facto temporary consulate, was searched more than once in his absence. His things were moved, his papers were examined. Nicholas understood that the noose was tightening and that his British citizenship might soon stop protecting him from brutal interrogation in some dark basement. It became painfully clear that he could not stay in Prague much longer, and that if the operation was going to survive, he would have to do something paradoxical but necessary: leave the city at once. Realizing that his physical presence in Prague would soon become impossible and would likely end in arrest, Nicholas made a difficult strategic decision. He needed to build a secure base, a legal structure, and a financial foundation for receiving rescued children in Britain. According to the stamps in his surviving passport, Winton crossed the border and returned to London on January 21, 1939. And here the story takes a dramatic turn. Who would remain in the middle of the storm to coordinate train departures and negotiate with local authorities? That dangerous role fell to his associate, Trevor Chadwick. His records show that before all this, he had simply been a schoolteacher. What kind of courage did it take for a modest teacher to stay behind in a city about to be swallowed by a ruthless war machine? On paper, the division of labor made sense. Chadwick would handle field operations in Prague and gather the children, while Winton fought through the bureaucracy in London. But reality was harsher than the young stockbroker had imagined. Once back in the quiet, carpeted offices of the British Home Office, Nicholas met a wall of incomprehension. Official minutes from that period reveal a disturbing indifference. Senior officials genuinely seemed unable to grasp why anything needed to be done quickly and suggested handling the matter through the usual process, which could take months. While in Czechoslovakia every hour mattered, in London they asked for endless forms in triplicate and calmly drank afternoon tea. Winton knocked on office doors, wrote petition after petition, and called every influential contact he had, trying to break through that wall of polite indifference. He argued that if the bureaucracy did not speed up, there would soon be no one left to save. Officials listened with mild irritation, treating him like an overly emotional alarmist. Eventually, under public pressure and after Nicholas's relentless efforts, the ice began to move. The British government finally agreed to let child refugees into the country, but only under one harsh and almost cynical financial condition that made the mission feel nearly impossible. Britain officially agreed to accept the children, but attached a condition that made the rescue operation almost unworkable. The Home Office demanded a financial guarantee of exactly £50 for every child entering the country. The money was supposed to ensure that the refugees would not become a burden on the state and could return home later if the political situation improved. And here a brutal question arises. Did the officials in London realize that they had effectively placed a price tag on a human life? For families who had lost everything in the occupied Sudetenland and were now sleeping on cold Prague streets, that sum was enormous and completely beyond reach. To understand the scale of that barrier, dry statistics are enough. Economic records from Britain show that the average yearly income of an ordinary worker at the time was about £150. In other words, saving just 3 children cost the equivalent of a full year's wages. Once Nicholas Winton grasped the hopelessness of the situation, he understood that the refugees themselves could never raise that money. It would have to be found in peaceful, comfortable London. He poured in his own savings, called wealthy clients, and begged business acquaintances to donate whatever they could. In letters from that period, his desperation is unmistakable. He appealed for help to anyone he could find, fully aware that every pound not raised meant one more life left behind. Before long, Winton's modest London flat had become a round-the-clock operations center. His mother, Barbara Winton, joined the effort and took on an enormous amount of paperwork. The telephone never stopped ringing. Piles of forms, letters, and petitions covered the table. They worked to exhaustion trying to build the fund, but money was only half the problem. The rules said the guarantee would only be accepted if a specific host family in Britain had already been found for each refugee. Funds came together slowly with the help of charities, but the most difficult problem lay elsewhere. How could ordinary British families be persuaded to take complete strangers into their homes? Children who were frightened, traumatized, and did not speak English? Faced with the need to find hundreds of host families as quickly as possible, Nicholas Winton made an unusual decision. He chose to use all the instincts of a stockbroker and, in the most literal sense, sell the idea of rescue to British society. He understood that dry lists of difficult foreign names would not move the public. People needed to see the faces of those they could save. Newspaper archives preserve appeals published in February 1939, when magazines such as Picture Post began carrying Winton's urgent campaign. And here, the deepest moral paradox appears. What does it feel like to turn living, frightened children into something like a display window? Knowing that the success of this campaign may determine whether they live or die, Nicholas and his mother Barbara organized what today would probably be called an aggressive marketing campaign. According to Winton's own records, more than 5,000 photographs of child refugees were secretly sent from Prague. Those black and white images, showing bewildered children and teenagers in their best but already travel-worn clothes, were carefully sorted in the London flat. Nicholas printed cards, prepared catalogs, and mailed them to potential guardians, orphanages, church communities, and charities. In later recollections, he said this was one of the most exhausting stages of the work, because he had to appeal directly to people's emotions, describing each child's qualities in the hope that a family would choose that one. Every letter, every catalog, was a cry for help disguised as a polite request. Winton personally met with potential guardians, reassured them, offered guarantees, and even acted as sponsor. And slowly the pressure began to work. Ordinary British citizens, from wealthy aristocrats to simple farmers, responded to the newspaper notices and agreed to take in refugees and pay the required guarantee. At last it seemed the system was beginning to function. The bureaucratic machine, slowly and reluctantly, started to issue life-saving entry permits. Host families had been found, financial guarantees were being secured, and the campaign was finally delivering real results. But at that exact moment, the political situation in Central Europe took such a sudden and terrible turn that there was no longer time for careful preparation. The atmosphere in Czechoslovakia grew more dangerous by the day, and Trevor Chadwick, still in Prague, was sending increasingly alarming coded messages to London. Waiting for long train convoys to be assembled had become too risky. Borders could close at any moment, so a dangerous decision was made to organize the first test evacuation and see whether the system they had built would actually work in practice. On March 14, 1939, that unprecedented logistical chain finally moved into action. Surviving flight records show that the first rescue was not by train at all, but by a chartered passenger aircraft. And that raises an obvious question. Why choose air travel for the pilot run, despite the high cost and the real danger in Europe's unstable skies? The answer was simple. There was almost no time left. According to information reaching underground relief groups, events were moving by the hour. The plane offered a chance to move a small group across closing borders, while avoiding land checkpoints and lengthy customs inspections. According to the passenger list from that historic flight, exactly 20 children were on board, 20 first lives pulled from the grip of disaster. Secret reports from local contacts described the boarding process as intensely tense and carried out under strict secrecy. Parents, handing their children over to attendants and escorts, tried not to cry so they would not attract the attention of secret police agents stationed everywhere. Everyone on that airfield understood that this farewell might be forever. The flight was successful, and soon 20 confused children stepped onto safe British soil, where host families found through Winton's newspaper campaign were already waiting. The test route had proved that the system worked. Real and forged papers had done their job. The mechanism was now in motion. It seemed there might finally be a chance to breathe and begin sending larger groups by train. Winton in London and Chadwick in Prague felt a brief wave of relief, the first small victory. But that relief was an illusion. The plane had escaped almost by miracle because the very next morning, the skies over Prague were darkened by the roar of enemy engines that changed the rules of the game forever. Any euphoria over the successful departure of the first 20 children vanished against the hard reality of war. Hope that the evacuation could now continue in an orderly way was crushed in a single cold March morning. Historical records show that on March 15th, 1939, the invasion of the rest of Czechoslovakia began. And here comes the central and frightening question. How could a humanitarian operation of this scale continue under such conditions when every foreigner instantly became a target for the security services? Eyewitness accounts from that day record a sudden drop in temperature and a dense snowstorm over Prague. It felt like a physical symbol of the long political winter, now descending over millions of lives. Messages secretly sent to London by the local resistance reported that checkpoints were blocked, stations were under guard, and regular passenger traffic had been paralyzed by military patrols. Trevor Chadwick, who had chosen to stay in the eye of the storm, watched from the window of his temporary shelter as endless columns of soldiers marched through Prague. The rules had changed in a single second. Any illusion that the crisis could still be solved through international agreements had vanished. The city was now in the grip of occupation. Refugees who had hoped to wait out the danger in temporary Prague barracks understood with horror that the trap had snapped shut. For them, that meant one thing. They would soon be sent to places of mass detention, from which almost no one returned. In his London office, Nicholas Winton read Chadwick's coded telegrams with growing dread. He understood that safe and legal evacuation routes no longer existed. Any attempt to move a group of children out in secret could now be treated as a serious crime against the new state order. The situation grew even worse because official aid committees began shutting down in panic, burning their records so they would not become ready-made execution lists for the new authorities. Winton's team was left alone with thousands of doomed people in a now isolated country. To save even one child, Trevor Chadwick would have to do something almost unthinkable: negotiate directly, face-to-face, with one of the most ruthless institutions of the Third Reich. The building where the new authorities had installed themselves quickly gained a terrible reputation and became an epicenter of fear for occupied Prague. That was where Trevor Chadwick had to go, into the lair of the secret police to try to pull children's lives from the jaws of a bureaucratic machine of destruction. Personnel records from that period include the name Karl Hermann Frank, one of the most powerful security figures in the Protectorate. And here normal human logic begins to break down. How could an ordinary English schoolteacher even begin a conversation with a system whose legal purpose was the organized destruction of those it considered undesirable? Chadwick knew perfectly well that once he crossed that threshold, one wrong word could cost him his life. To obtain the precious exit permits for Winton's children, Trevor had to play a daily game of deadly roulette. He put on his best suit, took his briefcase, and sat for hours in dark corridors waiting to see senior officers. Records from that period confirm that the new regime had imposed obsessive control over migration, demanding endless certificates and clearances for anyone hoping to leave. Chadwick had to use every tool he had: flattery, bluff, and above all bribery. In notes later preserved by his biographers, he mentioned huge sums paid to officials for a single transit stamp. What kind of nerve did it take to hand over those envelopes beneath portraits of the regime's leaders, in a place where the slightest suspicion of corruption or espionage could make a person disappear forever? Every signed document was a small but vital victory in that unseen war of endurance. Secret police officers, blinded by greed and certain of their own impunity, stamped papers allowing children to leave the Protectorate, never realizing that they were helping the British carry out one of the largest rescue operations in the region. Chadwick walked on a knife's edge, sending stacks of approved files to London and taking comfort in each small breach in the machinery of terror. But the next blow came from an entirely different direction. Local exit permits had been secured at enormous risk, yet officials in London delayed the British entry papers through sheer slowness, forcing Nicholas Winton to cross a line from charity into illegality. The bureaucratic paradox was bitter. In some ways, it was easier to overcome the enemy's resistance than the indifference of one's own government. Trevor Chadwick, risking his freedom, was obtaining exit visas in Prague. But to cross the British border, the children still needed official approval from the Home Office. According to the records of that time, the normal waiting period for a fully legal entry visa was between 3 and 6 weeks. But how could anyone wait that long when, in occupied Prague, events were moving by the hour? Receiving panicked telegrams from Chadwick saying the lists were ready and the trains might be cancelled at any moment, Winton understood that the lawful route would doom hundreds of children. The decision he made at that point changed the nature of his mission forever. It stopped being ordinary humanitarian work and became something closer to an underground operation. In later conversations with historians, Nicholas Winton admitted a shocking fact. In the spring of 1939, he gave the secret order to begin using forged documents on a mass scale. Did this respected British citizen realize that deliberately forging his own government's papers and stamps could have sent him to prison? Winton found a clandestine printer in London and ordered hundreds of forms that looked exactly like real Home Office visas. He filled in the children's names by hand, knowing full well that if the deception were discovered at the border, the scandal would destroy the entire route and send him behind bars. This was a dangerous game that demanded absolute nerve. In messages secretly passed by Winton's team to Prague, the instructions were clear. Ignore the official channels, do not wait for ministry letters, use only the forms sent by trusted courier. Those forged visas, still smelling of fresh ink, were hidden in luggage and carried back across Europe into Czechoslovakia. Nicholas Winton was knowingly breaking British law in order to obey a higher law of humanity. And once the bureaucratic barriers, both real and artificial, had been crossed, the most terrifying and unpredictable phase of the entire operation began. The documents were ready, the forged papers had reached Prague, and now it was time to step onto the station platform. The boarding of the first evacuation trains turned Prague's Wilson Station into a stage for unbearable human drama. Trevor Chadwick, who coordinated the departures on the spot, had to work with the cold precision of a surgeon, forcing himself to stay detached from an ocean of tears. Official instructions preserved in Prague archives state one strict and merciless rule. Each child could bring exactly one small suitcase. And here the moral question is crushing. How can parents who understand the full hopelessness of the situation fit an entire past life, all their love, and every memory of home into one tiny cardboard or wooden case? Into those suitcases they packed warm clothes, a few favorite toys, and family photographs sewn into the lining. The only things meant to remind the children of who they had been before disaster began. Museums dedicated to those events still preserve punched cardboard tags with 3-digit numbers that the children had to wear around their necks on thick string. What does it feel like to realize that your child, your own flesh and blood, has suddenly been reduced from a person with a name into an inventory number in a complex rescue chain? That loss of identity was a practical necessity, the only way not to lose the children in the chaos of transit, but for parents it became a visible symbol of separation. In his later recollections, Nicholas Winton wrote that hearing Trevor Chadwick describe the farewell scenes on the platform caused him almost physical pain, because mothers and fathers instinctively understood that with a 99% probability they were seeing their children for the last time. They were placing the most precious thing they had into the hands of British strangers simply to save them from detention and death. Armed patrols of the new authorities stood on the platform, scanning the crowd like predators waiting for the slightest excuse to arrest the escorts. Loud crying was forbidden. Any sign of panic or excessive emotion could attract the attention of secret police officers who had the power to cancel the hard-won permits at any moment. Parents pressed their lips to the cold windows of the departing carriages, trying to memorize their children's faces. Heavy metal doors slammed shut, the locomotive gave a long whistle, and the children's old lives were cut off from an unknown future. But the most dangerous test awaited the fragile train, not on the Prague platform, but several hours later at the first armed border with the Third Reich. As soon as the train crossed out of the Protectorate and moved deeper into Nazi Germany, the atmosphere in the carriages changed completely. Many of the children, away from their parents for the first time in their lives, curled into the corners of the compartments, clutching their small suitcases. Railway schedules later found by historians show that the full transit across the heart of the Reich lasted more than 20 exhausting hours, and that leads to another central question. What kind of emotional strength did the few escorts need in order to calm crying children inside sealed carriages moving through hostile darkness? They were not allowed to stop, not allowed to step onto German platforms. They were captives inside a metal tube racing through territory where the state ideology already openly demanded the destruction of people like these passengers. Memoirs from survivors mention at least 3 brutal night inspections by armed patrols at major stations. What would have happened if even one soldier had grown suspicious or simply wanted to impress his superiors? Reports secretly sent by members of the underground resistance noted that secret police officers regularly staged deliberately drawn-out searches of transit trains, inspecting documents and luggage in order to break the passengers psychologically. The escorts froze in terror each time they heard the heavy boots in the corridor and saw the hard beam of a flashlight sweep into the compartment. Back in the relative safety of his London office, Nicholas Winton spent sleepless nights imagining the journey with each train. He knew perfectly well what kind of time bomb was hidden in many of the children's papers. Patrols with German shepherds moved through the narrow corridors, examining every transit stamp and every British visa with mechanical care. The tension reached its absolute limit. The air inside the carriages felt thick with fear. If at that moment even one thorough officer had noticed an inconsistency in the forged London documents printed at Winton's secret order, the entire train would have been turned around and sent back into the center of catastrophe. Only when the train finally crawled toward the Dutch border did the endless hours of fear, the clatter of wheels, and the harsh German shouts begin to fade. Historical navigation records show that the key transit point on this complicated route was the Dutch port of Hook of Holland. Can you imagine the collective breath of relief, close to tears, when from the windows of those exhausted carriages the children finally saw not threatening swastikas and gray uniforms, but the welcoming faces of officials from a neutral country? Dutch customs officers, fully aware of who these children were, tried to process them as quickly and gently as possible, offering the shivering passengers hot tea and sweets right there on the windy platform. But it was still too early to relax. The chain of rescue was not complete. Surviving port registers from that tense period mention again and again the same life-saving vessel, a large passenger ferry with the symbolic name Prague, which was regularly used for the overnight crossing to Britain. How dangerous was that sea passage in the cold northern waters at a time when Europe was moving steadily toward war? Records from the period show that German intelligence was already watching those sea routes closely, logging the departure of large ships even before open war at sea had fully begun. Boarding the ferry took place in near total darkness. The children, exhausted by the road, by fear and by uncertainty, collapsed from fatigue on decks and in cramped cabins, falling asleep to the steady hum of the engines. The crossing to the British port of Harwich meant several more hours of motion and anxiety. And then at last, through the morning mist, the outline of the English coast appeared. Frozen and worn out, the children walked down the gangway still clutching their cardboard tags. They had reached the finish line, but Nicholas Winton, meeting them personally and guiding them onward, understood the harsh arithmetic of war. These few rescued children were only a small part of the larger tragedy, because back in occupied Prague, hundreds more were still waiting, and the window of opportunity was closing fast. Morning fog hung heavily beneath the steel arches of London's Liverpool Street station as another exhausted train pulled slowly into the platform. Railway records confirm that this station became the main point of arrival for all the rescue transports. On those decisive mornings, Nicholas Winton stood on the platform holding his meticulously prepared lists. He personally coordinated the handover of each child to a new guardian. And here another difficult psychological question appears. How do you organize the flawless transfer of hundreds of terrified children, most of whom spoke no English, to adults who had never seen them before? The noise of the crowd, the whistles of locomotives, and the shouts of porters created an atmosphere of chaos in which it was vital not to lose a single person. According to Winton's carefully prepared register, the rescued children ranged in age from toddlers as young as 2 to nearly grown boys and girls of 17. Many had spent several sleepless days in transit, overwhelmed by stress and unable to understand what was happening. In later recollections, he wrote that the hardest part of life on the platform was waiting for host parents who were delayed, or worse still, changed their minds at the last minute. Children whose names were called out awkwardly over the station loudspeaker stood with tags around their necks and watched in fear as the platform slowly emptied. Winton had to find emergency shelter on the spot, negotiate with charities, and personally calm those who had not been collected. The language barrier turned every meeting into a kind of pantomime. British farmers, London clerks, and provincial schoolteachers tried to explain with gestures that the children were now safe. But the relief of each successful handover was overshadowed by a constant and growing dread. Reports reaching Winton from Central Europe said that the political situation was approaching a breaking point and that the new authorities were openly preparing lists of unreliable citizens. Every day made the danger worse. The summer of 1939 was moving relentlessly toward its end, and with each departing transport, Nicholas Winton could feel the window of opportunity slamming shut on those who were still waiting for their turn. The summer of 1939 became a punishing race against time for the entire underground rescue network. Everyone involved could feel, almost physically, that a global catastrophe was approaching. According to Winton's notebooks, one of the largest and most difficult transports took place in July, carrying 241 children in a single movement. How was such an operation financed and organized at all when the fund behind it was already in serious financial crisis? The money for the required guarantees was disappearing fast. Winton was forced to mortgage his own property and beg creditors for more time, knowing that every payment delay translated directly into human lives at risk. At the same time, in occupied Prague, the situation moved beyond control. Records from the period show that the local secret police had begun actively investigating the rescue network. Detailed surveillance reports were prepared on the contacts of British citizens. The noose around Trevor Chadwick tightened. Security officers openly appeared at refugee gathering points, carried out long searches, and used harsh methods against local volunteers while demanding lists of everyone involved. Chadwick was moving closer and closer to arrest, which in practice meant detention, disappearance, and very likely death. Realizing that his exposure was only a matter of days, perhaps even hours, Trevor was forced to make the hardest decision of his life. Leaving the established lines of communication in the hands of a few trusted local people, he secretly escaped the protectorate, narrowly avoiding interception at the armed border. From that point on, the enormous burden of coordinating the remaining transports fell almost entirely on the London office. By late August, Nicholas was preparing the largest and 9th train of all, one that was supposed to carry an unprecedented number of desperate children to safety. But then a single date intervened in the course of history and changed the fate of an entire generation. Preparations for the largest transport were carried out under extreme paranoia and severe time pressure. Nicholas Winton worked around the clock, chasing down the last visas and paying the final guarantees from what little money remained. The departure date for that enormous train was set for September 1st, 1939. And here we come to the most terrible question in the entire story. Could anyone have foreseen that this very day would become the official beginning of the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century? From Winton's own diaries, historians know that on that morning exactly 250 children were gathered at Prague's central station, with bought tickets, packed suitcases, and numbered tags on their chests. 250 small lives sat in those carriages while their crying parents stood on the platform, waiting for the whistle that would save them. But the whistle never came. At dawn on September 1st, German troops crossed into Poland and the Second World War began. Reports from those chaotic hours state that by direct military order, all land borders were immediately sealed and international passenger rail traffic was suspended indefinitely. Wilson Station was surrounded by heavily armed patrols. The forged British visas in the escorts' pockets became useless scraps of paper in an instant, and the escorts themselves were now citizens of an enemy state. The rescue mechanism that Winton and his team had built piece by piece was destroyed in a single stroke. Occupation authorities ordered all passengers to leave the cars and clear the station. The scenes that followed on that platform are almost impossible to describe without deep horror. Parents in panic took their children back, understanding with painful clarity that the trap had closed and that the road to safety was gone. In London, Nicholas Winton listened in shock to emergency radio bulletins, realizing the full scale of what had happened. The largest, 9th train never left the platform, and the traces of those 250 children soon disappeared into the paperwork of the Nazi system that was methodically preparing for mass destruction. The silence that fell over Prague's Wilson station after that cancelled departure was more deafening than any artillery blast. For Nicholas Winton, sitting hundreds of kilometers away in London, it was not simply the collapse of a logistical operation. It was a deeply personal tragedy that would weigh on his conscience for the rest of his life. The fate of those left behind on the platform that morning was effectively sealed. Post-war demographic research suggests that of those 250 children from the 9th train, only a tiny number survived the war. And that leads to a terrible question. How can a human mind live with such a loss, knowing that those lives stood only one stamp, one whistle, and a few hours of travel away from safety? Winton replayed that scenario in his head again and again, reliving the collapse of hope. The fate of the parents was no less tragic. They had carried out an almost unthinkable act of self-sacrifice, handing their children over to British strangers in order to save them. Surviving transport records from the SS bureaucracy show with chilling precision that most of the parents of the rescued children were eventually sent to Theresienstadt, which for many became the last stop before further deportation. What level of despair and pain did those people carry in their final days, while still holding on to the hope that their sons and daughters had safely reached Britain? Reports preserved by members of the Prague resistance after the war suggest that many families held on to that belief until the very end. Yet Winton himself, after understanding the scale of the loss connected with the final train, saw his mission as a failure. He did not think of himself as a hero. He thought only of those he had not managed to save. Faced with that grief and that enduring guilt, Nicholas made a decision that seems almost unimaginable today. He closed the old leather briefcase filled with priceless documents, placed it in the darkest corner of his attic, and silently vowed to say nothing about the operation for half a century. The war erased the old peaceful life and replaced the desperate race for transit visas with the grim reality of global conflict. Nicholas Winton, unlike many London financiers, did not stay safely in the background. He joined the British Red Cross and worked as an ambulance driver during the bombings, then later transferred into the Royal Air Force. According to his service record, he remained in uniform until 1954, eventually leaving with the rank of flight lieutenant. And yet, the most astonishing fact is this. For almost 50 years, Sir Nicholas Winton said almost nothing about the rescue mission that had saved hundreds of children. History confirms this extraordinary fact. For nearly half a century, Winton kept silent. In all those years, he did not write memoirs, did not seek interviews, and did not turn his actions into a public legend. How can a person carry such a burden in silence for so long? The answer seems to lie in the way he counted what happened. He did not see 669 rescued children. He saw the 250 he had failed to get out on the final train. In his own mind, the arithmetic of his achievement was always broken by grief. For Winton, the mathematics of the rescue remained distorted by trauma. He fixated on those who had been left behind, not on those who had reached safety. That is why the briefcase disappeared into the attic, and why the documents stayed there for decades. To the world, Nicholas Winton remained simply a respectable British man with an ordinary past. The story might have died with him if not for a chance discovery in 1988, when his wife Greta found the old leather case and opened it. Inside was the full hidden archive, lists of names, photographs, letters, and documents, proving the scale of what he had done. That discovery eventually led to one of the most moving moments ever seen on British television. In a brightly lit London studio, an elderly gentleman in a plain suit sat quietly in the front row of the audience. He was Sir Nicholas Winton, invited to the program That's Life. Without fully understanding what had been prepared for him, the scene seemed ordinary. The host began speaking about the rescue of children from Prague before the war. Then she asked a simple question. Was anyone in the studio alive today because of Nicholas Winton? Behind the scenes, journalists had spent months tracking down the surviving children he had saved. In production notes later released, it became clear just how difficult that search had been. Many were now scattered across different countries, living ordinary lives unaware that they were about to confront the man who had changed everything for them. The question hung in the air for a moment. Then one person stood up, then another, and another. Soon, much of the audience was on its feet. Winton, visibly stunned, turned around and realized that he was surrounded by the grown men and women whose lives he had saved. They were no longer frightened children with number tags around their necks. They were doctors, engineers, teachers, parents, and grandparents. Nicholas Winton, a man who had spent decades believing mainly in his own failure, suddenly saw the living proof of what he had actually done. The emotional force of that moment is difficult to describe. It was not simply gratitude, it was the return of 669 stolen futures. In that television studio, the abstract number in the old register became real, human, and alive. That unforgettable broadcast was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a much larger understanding. The children Winton had pulled out of the approaching catastrophe had grown up and gone on to live remarkable lives. Some became scientists, some artists, some public figures, doctors, and engineers. And that raises the deepest question of all. How do you measure the true value of a single human decision? An ordinary London stockbroker, with no army and no intelligence service behind him, had challenged a vast and merciless state machine built for destruction and won a stunning victory over it. In later interviews, survivors kept returning to the same idea. Winton did not simply save their lives. He gave them an entire universe of possibility. The mathematics of that achievement becomes even more astonishing with time. According to figures associated with the Winton family, more than 6,000 descendants of those rescued children are alive in the world today. More than 6,000 lives scattered across continents, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, exist because one young man at the end of 1938 decided to give up a ski holiday and walk into a crisis that was not his own. That number stands as a final judgment on the darkest ideology of the last century. The totalitarian regime that sent innocent people toward destruction collapsed long ago in shame, while the forged visas printed in secret on Winton's orders gave birth to entire generations who continue to live and build the world. Sir Nicholas Winton himself, later knighted for his exceptional service to humanity, remained astonishingly modest until the very end of his life. He never saw himself as the hero of a spy thriller, even though his methods in Prague, secrecy, deception, and nerve under pressure, would fit perfectly into the best books on covert operations. He simply saw terrible injustice and addressed the logistical problem step by step, regardless of mortal danger and bureaucratic resistance on both sides. According to official obituaries, this remarkable man died peacefully on July 1st, 2015, at the age of 106. He left the world surrounded by the love of the vast family he had created with his own hands, largely in secret. His story remains one of the clearest documentary proofs that even in the darkest times, when an entire continent seems to be falling into the abyss, one brave person can still stand in the way of absolute evil and change the course of history,